Benedict Arnold is known as the ultimate traitor who turned his back on the American Revolution. But what if his actions were justified, and he was actually right for doing what he did? Before Benedict Arnold switched sides, he was one of the most effective American generals of the Revolutionary War. He played a key role in the victory of Saratoga, which helped convince France to back the American cause. Without that, the revolution may not have survived. So what exactly happened? Well, Arnold believed deeply in the revolutionary cause, at first. But over time, he became disillusioned. Congress passed over him for promotion multiple times, while rewarding less competent but better connected officers. His resentment may have followed the Battle of Saratoga, where he led a reckless charge against British defenses and was shot in the left leg, the same one he'd already injured at Quebec, shattering the bone and nearly costing him the limb. He spent months recovering, only to return to a government that treated him with suspicion and, in his view, contempt. He also believed the revolution was being mismanaged. And the part that complicates things is, Arnold wasn't wrong. The Continental Congress was poorly funded and riddled with infighting. Supplies weren't reaching the troops. Officers were leaving the army because they hadn't been paid in months. And Arnold, who had personally covered military expenses out of his own pocket, was now drowning in debt. Arnold argued that the revolution had been hijacked by self-serving politicians. He believed that continued war would only lead to more chaos and suffering. In his mind, rejoining the British might restore order, protect property rights, and prevent a descent into mob rule. So, when the British approached him, promising both money and a chance to help end the war, he took it. Not just out of greed, but because he genuinely believed that switching sides might bring stability, and maybe even save lives. In 1780, he made his move. He agreed to hand over the American fort at West Point to the British in exchange for money and a commission in the British Army. The plot failed. Barely, and Arnold fled behind British lines. From that point on, he was branded a traitor by the very country he'd once risked his life to not only defend, but create. He didn't think he was betraying America. He thought he was trying to save it. So the question isn't just whether Benedict Arnold was a traitor. The question is, if you believed the revolution had already been lost to corruption, what would be the right thing to do? To some, Edward Snowden is a whistleblower who exposed illegal surveillance. To others, he's a traitor who endangered national security. Before the media firestorm and exile in Russia, Snowden was a systems contractor working for the NSA. He had top-level clearance and access to some of the most sensitive intelligence programs in the U.S. government. What he saw disturbed him. The NSA wasn't just tracking foreign terrorists, it was collecting massive amounts of data on ordinary Americans. Emails, calls, texts, often without warrants, and with only limited, secretive oversight from Congress or the FISA court. Snowden believed the public had the right to know how far their government surveillance had gone, especially after 9/11. So, in 2013, he leaked a trove of classified documents to journalists. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The U.S. charged him under the Espionage Act. Intelligence officials called him a traitor. He fled, first to Hong Kong, then to Russia, where he remains in exile. A choice some criticize given Russia's own surveillance practices, but one he claims was his only option to avoid prosecution. But here's where things get tricky. Years later, multiple courts, including a U.S. federal court, ruled that some of the surveillance programs Snowden exposed were unconstitutional. The leaks sparked actual reforms. Tech companies overhauled encryption. Congress passed the U.S. Freedom Act. And internationally, privacy rights became a much bigger part of the conversation. Snowden didn't sell secrets to a foreign power. He didn't do it for money. He gave classified information to journalists and let them decide what to publish. His goal, he claimed, was to force a public debate about government power in a digital age. Did he damage national security? Possibly, though the government has never provided concrete evidence of lives lost or missions compromised because of the leaks. Did he break the law? Absolutely, but he also revealed that the government was breaking its own laws and lying about it. Wang Jingwei's name is still one of the most hated in modern Chinese history. In World War II, he led a Japanese-backed puppet regime in Nanjing, while China was still fighting against Japan's brutal occupation. From most perspectives, that's treason. Wang wasn't some fringe opportunist. He had once been a top revolutionary, a close ally of Sun Yat-sen, and one of the early leaders of the Chinese nationalist movement. He had fought for Chinese independence, not Japanese domination. So why did he switch sides? By the late 1930s, China was collapsing under Japanese invasion. Cities had been destroyed and millions had lost their lives. Wang, who had clashed with Chiang Kai-shek over peace talks as early as 1938, believed that continuing to resist Japan with a divided leadership and limited resources would only bring more destruction. So in 1940, he formally broke away, forming a rival government under Japanese protection. He claimed he was trying to save what was left of China, to preserve its people and institutions by cooperating, not resisting. He argued that if Japan's victory was inevitable, then the least China could do was negotiate from a position of influence, rather than face total annihilation. But here's the problem. Japan wasn't interested in Chinese autonomy. Wang's government had no real power. It was a facade. While he believed he could use diplomacy to minimize the hardship of his people, Japan continued its forced labor and widespread brutality across occupied territories. Wang's actions can and have been judged as more cowardly than pragmatic. After all, he gave legitimacy to an invading force. And even if he had noble intentions, the result was a government that helped prop up Japan's occupation of China. Wang Jingwei's life ended in Nagoya, Japan in 1944, before the war ended. Afterward, his legacy was cemented in China as a traitor. But was Wang trying to sell out China, or save it from what he believed was certain destruction? And does it matter if betrayal is done out of desperation, not ambition? In the Soviet Union, calling someone a Vlasovite is still one of the worst things you can say. Andrei Vlasov wasn't just a traitor, he became the traitor, a decorated Red Army general who ended up fighting for Hitler. It's one of the ugliest, most tangled stories of World War II. Vlasov had been a rising star in Stalin's army. He fought bravely in the defense of Moscow and was praised for his leadership with potential to become a future marshal of the Soviet Union. But then came 1942. He was captured by the Germans during a disastrous campaign near Kharkov, where his army was cut off and crushed. Most Soviet officers in that position lost their lives in camps or were executed later for surrendering. But Vlasov saw a third path. He agreed to lead what became the Russian Liberation Army, a Nazi-backed force made up of Soviet POWs, all of them bitter and disillusioned with Stalin's regime. He wasn't a puppet, he was an active and willing collaborator. Vlasov gave speeches, signed manifestos, and posed for propaganda. And the things Vlasov said about the Soviet regime, the purges, the show trials, the forced famines, the gulags, they were all real. He wasn't making them up. And that's where things get a bit murky. Because while he claimed he was in this to fight against Stalin, not the Russian people, he was siding with the Nazis, who were a genocidal empire ravaging Soviet lands and had just destroyed millions of lives in Eastern Europe. The enemy of your enemy isn't always your friend. And in this case, that enemy was Nazi Germany. By the end of the war, even the Nazis didn't fully trust him. And when his troops finally turned on the Germans and tried to assist a Czech uprising in 1945, it was too late. Vlasov was captured by the Soviets, brought back to Moscow, and executed. But that's the risk you run when you turn on a brutal dictator by siding with an even worse one. The elimination of Julius Caesar is probably the most famous betrayal in Western history, and Marcus Junius Brutus was right at the center of it. To Brutus, Caesar wasn't just a dictator, he was Brutus's mentor, a political patron, and maybe even a father figure. And still, Brutus helped plunge a knife into his chest on the Senate floor. Why? Because Brutus believed, or at least claimed to believe, that Caesar was about to destroy the Roman Republic, that he was turning a government of laws into what was essentially monarchy. And in all fairness, he wasn't wrong. Caesar had declared himself dictator for life. He'd bypassed the Senate and concentrated power in ways that made Roman elites panic. Brutus saw himself as a protector of the Republic, a guardian of the old order. He thought that by taking out Caesar, Rome could return to its republican system, where no one man held absolute power. But that's not what happened. Instead, with Caesar gone, chaos followed. Civil war, bloodshed, and ultimately the rise of Caesar's heir, Octavian, who would become Augustus, the first true emperor of Rome. In trying to save the Republic, Brutus may have pushed it closer to collapse, though truth be told, Rome's system was already cracking under the weight of rival warlords and a restless army. And the public? They didn't rise up in support of the so-called liberators. They mourned Caesar. Brutus took his own life 2 years later after losing the Battle of Philippi. So was Brutus just a cold-blooded backstabber or a tragic idealist who tried to stop Rome from becoming an empire? Claus von Stauffenberg wore the German uniform, but he lost his life trying to destroy the Nazi regime from within. He wasn't a fringe radical or a double agent. He was a high-ranking officer with aristocratic roots, a decorated veteran, and, for a long time, a believer in German nationalism. But as the war dragged on, and the true scale of the regime's brutality became undeniable, something shifted. He had seen the mass executions. He had read reports from the Eastern Front, and he decided that staying loyal meant becoming complicit. So, in July 1944, Stauffenberg walked into Hitler's command center with a bomb in a briefcase. He placed it just a few feet from the Führer, walked out, and waited. The bomb went off, but Hitler walked away with only minor injuries, shielded by a heavy table. The plot unraveled within hours. Stauffenberg was arrested and executed that same night. At the time, he was branded a coward, a backstabber, a disgrace to the uniform. The Nazi propaganda machine made sure his name was synonymous with betrayal. But in post-war Germany, something flipped. His face is now on memorials, statues, even school buildings. The resistance he led is remembered not as an act of treason, but as a rare moment of moral clarity in a regime defined by horror. It seemed Stauffenberg tried to give Germany a second chance, even if it meant being remembered as a traitor. And for a while, he was. When you hear the name Guy Fawkes today, you probably picture a mask, not a man. It's a symbol of resistance, protest, or rebellion. But the real Guy Fawkes, his plan was simple. He was a man with a plan. Blow up the English Parliament, take out the king, and spark a Catholic uprising to seize the throne. The year was 1605. England was officially Protestant, and Catholics were being fined, imprisoned, and sometimes executed just for practicing their faith. Fawkes and a small group of conspirators believed the only way to end the persecution was through force, total regime change. Their logic: if the king won't hear us, maybe he'll feel us. So Guy Fawkes literally packed 36 barrels of gunpowder beneath the House of Lords, enough to vaporize Parliament, King James I, the royal family, and most of the government. But there was no kaboom. The plot failed. The authorities had been tipped off, and Fawkes was caught guarding the explosives. He was subjected to brutal treatment and sentenced to be executed. Always the rebel, Fawkes nullified the state's plans when he jumped from the scaffold and broke his neck. His life ended there instantly. So was he a freedom fighter, or just a religious extremist with a short fuse? Depends on which part of the story you focus on. He fought for religious liberty, but also planned a mass casualty event. He resisted state persecution, but aimed to replace one authoritarian system with another. Centuries later, that face, the mask, resurfaced. It became a symbol of anonymous resistance, from comic books to global protests. In 1918, Philippe Pétain was a hero, the savior of Verdun, the man who held the line when France was on the verge of collapse in World War I. By 1940, he was back, older, slower, and standing at the head of a defeated nation. France had fallen to Nazi Germany in just 6 weeks. The government collapsed. The military was shattered. Paris was occupied, and Pétain was brought in as a steady hand during a national emergency. He accepted the role, and then he signed an armistice with Hitler. He said he was shielding the nation from worse destruction, that collaboration was necessary to preserve French identity and sovereignty, that resistance would only lead to annihilation. So, under Pétain's leadership, the French government moved to Vichy and began collaborating with the Nazis. It was a move for survival, but by passing anti-Semitic laws, rounding up Jews, and handing over dissidents, the Vichy government echoed Nazi policies, acting as an arm of the Nazi Party, even if they were driven to do so in a desperate bid to save France. After the war, France didn't buy it. Pétain was tried for treason and found guilty. He was sentenced to capital punishment, though the sentence was later commuted due to his age. So was Pétain's devil's bargain justified to save France? And is survival justified if you have to become a monster to do so? Oleg Penkovsky may have helped prevent nuclear war. A high-ranking Soviet military officer during the Cold War, Penkovsky reached out voluntarily to British and American intelligence and started passing information. And not scraps either. He handed over technical specs, classified Soviet military doctrine, and detailed intelligence on nuclear missile capabilities, stuff the West had no access to, until him. So why did he do it? Penkovsky claimed he feared Soviet leadership was reckless enough to start World War III. He described Khrushchev as erratic and unpredictable. Penkovsky's intelligence proved invaluable during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The West now knew Soviet missiles were not as ready or as numerous as Khrushchev claimed. That knowledge gave Kennedy room to negotiate, rather than launch a preemptive strike. In other words, Penkovsky's betrayal gave Kennedy the edge to negotiate, helping cool a crisis that could have ended the world. But the price was steep. The Soviets caught him, and he was tried in secret and executed. To the USSR and KGB, he was a traitor and the ultimate failure of internal security. And yet it can also be said that he was a man who saved the world and never got the credit. So Penkovsky was undoubtedly a traitor to his nation, but when the result potentially saves millions or even billions, was he right? John Brown believed the enslavement of Black Americans was a moral crime so great that it could only be ended with violence. And in 1859, he acted on that belief. He led a raid on a federal armory in Harpers Ferry, Virginia, with the goal of triggering a massive uprising of enslaved Americans across the South. His plan was to seize thousands of government weapons, arm enslaved people, and spark a war to destroy the practice at its roots. He brought 21 men with him, a mix of white and black abolitionists, including his own sons. They succeeded in taking the armory. They cut telegraph lines, captured hostages, and held the town for a short time. But the uprising he hoped for never came. Local enslaved people didn't join, some out of fear, others because they hadn't heard what was happening. And within a day, Brown and his men were surrounded by militia, and then U.S. Marines led by Robert E. Lee. A brutal fight broke out. Most of Brown's men were captured or lost their lives. 2 of his sons did not survive. Brown himself was wounded and taken prisoner. He was quickly tried in Virginia, not just for homicide and inciting rebellion, but for treason against the state. He was found guilty and executed. Just 16 months later, the Civil War began. To the South, he was a terrorist. To many in the North, he was a madman. But to others, especially after his execution, he became something of a martyr. In his autobiography, Frederick Douglass wrote, "Though a white gentleman, he is in sympathy a black man, and as devoted as any of us can be to the cause of our emancipation." Harriet Tubman called him the man who would free the slaves. And years later, Union soldiers would march into battle singing John Brown's Body. Did he break the law? Absolutely. But when the law is unjust and there's no political mechanism for justice, can the violence be justified? And was John Brown right to do what he did? There was no single Tokyo Rose. It was a nickname invented by U.S. troops for any English-speaking woman broadcasting propaganda on Japanese radio during World War II. But after the war, that name got pinned to one person, Eva Toguri. She was a Japanese American who'd been stranded in Japan when the war broke out. She refused to renounce her U.S. citizenship even under pressure. Eventually, she got a job at Radio Tokyo, reading scripted lines between American jazz records and military updates. Toguri wasn't encouraging desertion or giving away secrets. The broadcasts were satire, jokes, skits, obvious propaganda that most GIs found amusing, though some brass worried they might hit a nerve. When the war ended, the U.S. was looking to punish those seen as helping the enemy. And even though they had no concrete evidence that she had said anything to aid the enemy or demoralize U.S. troops, she was arrested, tried, and convicted of treason. It was largely based on coerced testimony. The prosecution's case relied heavily on 2 key witnesses, who later admitted they lied under oath after being coached and paid by U.S. investigators. Journalists later admitted they'd helped fabricate the case by editing a taped interview. She served about 6 years in prison from 1949 to 1956. Decades later, after a public campaign and fresh investigation, she was pardoned by President Gerald Ford. So, was she a traitor? Apparently not. But she was treated like one for years and punished for a name and crimes that were assigned to her, not what she actually did. Thank you very much for watching the video and making it to the end. So, what do you think about these traitors? Were they justified in their betrayal? And did we miss any? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you liked the video, please give us a like. It really helps the channel. There should be another video about traitors on your screen right now, so click it and check it out. Thanks again. See you next time.